So let's see what is async and await. So async function, when you put a function before the function, if you put a keyword as async, which means that this is an async function, which means that function can execute in parallel, right? And async function always returns a promise. We will see what is a promise in detail, but for now we just understand that this can execute in parallel. What it means is usually these async functions, right? You basically use this function to get some information from the database, right? To connect to a database, to get some data from the database, and all right. In the front end, right, you use fetch. So fetch is a async function, right? So these async function will take time. So what happens is in your call stack, right? Uh, you have your global execution context, and then your async function get data will come. Okay, and okay, what is the importance of async function is, see, I told you that JavaScript is a synchronous single threaded. If it is not async now, you are calling this function here, right? This function has to complete. After this function completes only, the next line of code will be executed because JavaScript is synchronous. But when you put this function as async and it is doing some operation like fetching some data from the database and all, what will happen is this execution of get data will be suspended in the call stack. Once it is request for the data from the database and it is suspended now, this is your main thread, right? Your main thread will resume. And whatever after this line of code, right, that will get executed. Okay, so this is what happens. This is what the importance of async. When you put a function as async, it will go to the call stack, it will get executed. But if it is taking some time, right, if it is waiting for something now, the execution will be suspended and your main thread execution will resume. Okay, and after, suppose this wait is over, like after this you get the data, then this get data function execution will resume. This is what is asynchronous function, and this, you call this operation as asynchronous operation, which can run in parallel, right? And so this is what is async. This async always returns a promise. Okay, just you see, right, I just give a brief intro of promise. So promise is nothing but a JavaScript object. Okay, so I told you, right, this basically, right, you have to execute one part of code, like let's say the code is that part of the code is A. Here, what is the A part of the code? Let's assume that it is fetching data from the backend, right? And when after the data is fetched successfully, you have to execute B code. Okay, before success scenario, data is fetched, you have to do some operation with the data. You have to execute B code. If the fetch any issue happens during fetch, you have to execute C code. That is during error case. Okay, so basically this is basically called the producer code, right? Which is fetches the data. It is producing something, and this success, right? After the data is fetched, it is consuming the data. With the data is doing displaying something, right? This is the consuming code, and probably this is the error code, right? So after the producer code completes, only this consumer code has to execute, right? So promise JavaScript object, right? It is used to link the producing code and consuming code, which means that it will execute the consuming code only after the producing code has finished. Now, so in the asynchronous operation, mainly promise is used. Okay, so let's see how that happens. Okay, in detail. So this is what is async. Async function can run in parallel and it will go to the call stack, but if it waits for any operation, the execution will get suspended and the main thread will continue its execution. The main thread will not be blocked. So in our case, right, this get data is returning a string. But as we told, right, async function always returns a promise. So this string will be wrapped inside a promise. So inside a promise, this string will be the namaste. Okay. So promise is JavaScript object, right? Inside the object, namaste will be there. So each promise, right, you consider that this is an object, JavaScript object, it has some data. The object will have data and functions, right? So inside the object, some data is there, and this data will be put into this JavaScript object, which is the promise. This namaste will be part of it. So what is there in the promise data? Namaste will be there. So whenever you return some value, your JavaScript will put it inside a promise. Promise is a JavaScript object. It will put it inside a promise and then return the promise. Now what you have done? You have got a promise object. So you are registering a resolve function. That's it. Dot then is what? Dot then you are registering a function. This function will be called when the promise resolves. What do you mean by promise is resolving? You fetching the data, right? The data has come, data is fetched successfully. Then the promise resolves. Okay. If there is any error, promise will reject. So there are three states for promise. One is pending, resolve, reject. Resolve is promise is fulfilled. Reject na some error has happened. These are the three states of promise. Okay. So here the execution is, this is the function, will not get executed. Come to this line number, this get data function will be called, this returns a promise, that promise will be assigned to this. Okay, and then when you call this, right, dot then, you are basically registering a function, right, dot then. When it resolves now, this dot then function will be called. What is the data you are passed? This is the data you are passed. That data will come here. Okay, when you do some execution, you will understand. So if you take this example, here you are creating a promise. Okay, so this is how you create an object in JavaScript. Okay, and then you are passing two values. One is, this is resolve is a function, reject is a function. So in this promise, you can do any operation here, like fetch, all these things, anything you want to do, you can do the operation. Then you are calling resolve function. Resolve function, when you call the promise, will be resolved. Okay, so how this execution happen? First, this object will be created, correct? And this is a function, it will not be executed. And then you are calling get data. Get data returns this promise. Async function. So you have this promise, you have assigned to data promise. Okay, this is the promise, right? So this promise when executing, right, this will already resolved. So that promise dot then function you are calling, right? To the then you are giving a function. That function will be called when your promise is resolved. So when you create an object itself, this function is called. That function is already called the resolve function. The promise is already resolved. So when you do this, this function will be called automatically. Okay. Now, what is this res? This is the data inside the promise. When you are resolving, what is the data you have passed? This is the data you passed, right? That is the data inside the promise. So this res will be this data. What is the data inside the promise? So when you console log res, your promise resolved value will get printed. So instead of resolve, you can call reject also. See, basically what is this? You are creating an object. In that you are passing a function. Right? So while creating an object, the constructor will be called and this function is registered and this function will be called immediately. And in this function you are calling resolve. Resolve now, promise dot then whatever function is there, that function will be called. If you are calling reject now, this reject also you can call. This reject you usually call when there is an error message. And then what function will be called now? This data promise dot catch. CA. This is dot. I put it here. This is promise, data promise, right? I'll put DP. Data promise dot catch. Instead of then, you can put catch, and similarly, this kind of function you can put it here. So when you call reject, right? In catch, whatever functions you are given, that function will be called. If you call resolve, whatever function in the then, that will be called. So now you see the promise is the producer and consumer code. This promise, right? What happens? It will do the fetch here. Above the line number 13, it can do any data. It can fetch the data, all these things. Once you fetch the data, you are resolving it. Once you resolve only, this then function will be called. Which means what? After the producing code produces the data, then only you are calling resolve. The resolve this function, right? That is the consuming code. So you are linking the producing code and the consuming code using promise. Right? That is how promise is used. What is our take? Producing code is A. A will be here. The A code will be here, which is to fetch data from the database and all. What is B is the consuming code. When success happens, that is there in the dot then function. This is the B code. When any happened in this, you have to call C code, which is the error. That is there in the catch function. So you implemented that using promise.